Hi, my name is Joe Crespino. It is my great honor to be the Jimmy Carter Chair of American History at Emory University. And thank you. Thank you. It is a great honor. I'm also chair of the history department. This fall, I'm starting my 20th year at Emory, and it's been an amazing 20 years. I'm so privileged to be a faculty member at Emory, and it's so great to see former students and friends here in Washington, D.C. at this beautiful, historic site of American political history. One of the great privileges I've had as an Emory faculty member is to teach for about 9 or 10 times a course on the life and presidency of Jimmy Carter. Now, this began shortly after I arrived at Emory because the dissertation I was revising into a book, the last chapter, I needed to do research at the Carter Presidential Library. And when I went there, it was amazing, the holdings that we had, and it was so close to campus. And I thought, well, we need a class where we're teaching out of these archives. And so I started that class in about my 3rd year. And the amazing thing about the class, the amazing Emory experience, is that I would put students loose in the presidential archives, and they would write these 25-page research papers based on original, historical documents from his presidency. And then in the final class, President Carter would come to class. And the students would ask him questions about the research that they've been doing. Now, sometimes, we would have students who would write about things that President Carter has talked about for, thousands of times. The decision to boycott the 1980 Olympics, or the malaise speech. Some of my favorite times in my teaching career were times we would get students who would write about topics that President Carter hadn't thought about in 40 years, right? Where's Marielle? Marielle was one of my former students. She wrote an amazing paper on the Carter administration policy towards Rhodesia, which was something that he hadn't thought a lot about, right? And the conversations were amazing. Probably my favorite topic was this student who he showed up. He had spent his junior year studying abroad in Budapest, and this is a kid who you would not expect much from this kid. He'd show up most of the semester. He came to class in his pajamas. I suspect he did a lot of beer drinking in Budapest. And he told me that he wanted to write a paper on the decision of the Carter administration to return the crown of St. Stephen to the Hungarian people. And I didn't know anything about it, so I said, well, great, well, look what you can find and see what you can figure out. Well, he started researching it, and it seemed like it was mostly like a kind of a second-level decision being made in the State Department. He found some interesting things, but he had no indication of what the White House was working on and what they were doing. And so when President Carter came to the final class, he was kind of sheepish about it. We were going through the topics, and he said, well, I kind of wrote on the decision to return the crown of St. Stephen's to the Hungarian people. And President Carter said, wait a minute. You wrote about what? And President Carter hadn't thought about this in years, but President Carter went on to talk about how not only did he know about it, he was intimately involved in all the decision-making right over there in that house, right over there, and that he was thinking about it and making calls out of the Oval Office. And he told the story, and he teared up telling it, about how he was, after his presidency, he was the Grand Marshal in the parade in Budapest. And it was a really difficult decision because this was still during the Cold War. And on one hand, you didn't, by the way, the crown of St. Stephen's, this was a relic of Hungarian Catholicism that during World War II, the American army took it because they didn't want the communists to destroy it. And so it sat in Fort Knox, Kentucky for decades, right? And so the Carter administration was deciding whether or not to give it back. On one hand, you don't want to give it back because you don't know what the communists will do with it, right? And you don't want to give any support to that regime. But on the other hand, you want to promote kind of religious faith and reform movements within the Eastern Bloc countries. And that's what they did, and that was the effect that it had. And it was a deeply meaningful thing for President Carter as a Christian to promote, religious faith in this Eastern Bloc nation. And so it's just amazing to be in that class and see that kind of thing happen. So I've loved teaching this class. I've read a lot of papers. Most of them are really good. Some of them have not been good. So I've read a lot of papers and research on the Carter presidency. And, there's kind of a conventional wisdom about Jimmy Carter, which is that, he's probably the greatest ex-president that ever lived. But that, his presidency itself was pretty mediocre. That's the conventional wisdom on Jimmy Carter. And no doubt he had his failures and his limitations during his presidency. The knock on Jimmy Carter is he didn't handle Congress well. And he had a lot of famous battles with Tip O'Neill and other congressmen and that kind of thing. Although he did pass a ton of legislation, his administration did, during his term as presidency. Another knock is he probably didn't trust people enough. He did a lot of he took a lot on himself. He started off not having a chief of staff famously. His key operators in the White House were his campaign staff mostly. People like Jody Powell and Hamilton Jordan, who were 33 and 34 years old at the time. Charlie Curbo was the King and Spalding lawyer who had been with Carter from his beginning in the Georgia legislature. And famously, Charlie Curbo didn't come to Washington with him. Charlie Curbo wanted to stay in Atlanta. He would come up and visit every couple of weeks. But if I could run back the Carter administration and change anything, I would make sure that Charlie Curbo was in D.C. every day as chief of staff from the start. I think it might have made a difference. But Carter was also hit with some terrible situations that no president would have been able to respond well to. Things like, stagflation, this bizarre economic condition, and things, of course, like the Iran hostage crisis. But, there were obvious notable successes throughout his presidency. One of the ones that a lot of students write about is his decision to make human rights at the center of his foreign policy. He gave a famous speech at Notre Dame in 1977 when he talked about how he was going to make human rights the centerpiece of his presidency. And he did, and it had notable effects in countries like Rhodesia, in countries like Hungary. Obviously, the Camp David Accords, a historic peace accord that still exists to this day and still is one of the most important peace accords between the United States and Middle Eastern countries. He finished the hardest part of the Panama Canal negotiations. Those were negotiations that had started way back during the Lyndon Johnson administration, had been a bipartisan effort through all the presidencies, but he had the hardest job in actually getting the new treaty in place, replacing a treaty that was, dated back to the early 20th century and was a horrible example of kind of American colonialism in Latin America. And that was another part of his human rights agenda. And of course, he signed some of the most significant environmental legislation of any president up to that point. But given the way his presidency ended, or given the way that his presidency has come to be remembered, it's easy to forget, I think, what an incredible breath of fresh air that Jimmy Carter was when he emerged as a presidential candidate in 1974 and 75 and 76. There's a great quote. Jonathan Alter wrote a recent biography of Jimmy Carter that's really good. And he talks about the period when Jimmy Carter is running for presidency. He talked about the British novelist Anthony Burgess, who visited the United States in 1971. And Burgess was struck by, quote, the neurosis, the despair, the Kafka feeling that the whole marvelous fabric of American life is coming apart at the seams. Sound familiar? It was, Alter writes, a shaggy and confused time that managed to be both broad-minded and sour at once. That was the period that Jimmy Carter entered national political life. There was this Watergate hangover, this great sense of disillusionment about what the country had been through and where the country was going. And Carter emerged out of a huge, crowded Democratic primary. He'd only been a one-term, governor of a southern state. Before Carter, the last Southerner to be elected to the White House was Zachary Taylor in 1848. Carter couldn't succeed himself as Georgia governor in 1974, and truth be told, he probably wouldn't have won anyway. He had alienated a lot of important constituencies as governor of Georgia, but that's when his young advisors hatched this plan for him to run for president. Now, a key moment, I want to take you back to a key moment in his presidential campaign. It's one of my favorite speeches that Jimmy Carter ever gave. This was the Law Day speech at the University of Georgia in 1974. Now, this was the setting. Ted Kennedy, who was down there in Athens, and he was the keynote speaker, all right? And Jimmy Carter, he spoke in the morning, and Jimmy Carter was going to speak in the afternoon. And there were national press reporters who were there to cover Kennedy's speech, because Kennedy was testing the waters to see if he could recover from the Chappaquiddick tragedy and be a major player again in the presidential campaign of 1976. So Kennedy speaks that morning about Watergate and its political implications. And Jimmy Carter's sitting there in the audience with him. And basically, Kennedy says everything that Carter was going to say in the afternoon. So as Carter tells the story, over lunch, he goes into the restroom and scribbles down some notes on a few pieces of paper. And then he goes to give his speech that afternoon. And it's a remarkable speech. You should Google it tonight when you go home. Google the Jimmy Carter, the Georgia Law Day speech, 1974. He starts off by quoting lyrics from Bob Dylan. He goes on to talk about Reinhold Niebuhr, the great theologian of mid-20th century America, and his famous book, Moral Man and Immoral Society. He talked a lot about criminal justice reform. And it's remarkable when you go back and read the speech how forward-looking the speech is. It hits on many themes in current debates today about criminal justice reform. He talked about how 9,100 inmates in the Georgia prison system, there were 9,100 inmates, and he said about 50% of them shouldn't be there. They should be on probation or some other form of supervision. But my favorite part of the speech is how he ends the speech with this soaring, and remember, he's just speaking from notes, that this soaring kind of reflection on his childhood in Plains, where his beloved teacher, when he was 12 years old, challenged him to read War and Peace. Now, War and Peace as a 12-year-old, I think there may be a little bit of mythology to this story. I'm not sure. I'd like to see the sources on that, my fellow historian. But anyway, he reflects on having read War and Peace. And I want to read a quote from this speech. And I think it gives you a good sense of who Jimmy Carter was and how Americans would have received him at this moment of demoralization and cynicism. He talks about the point of the book, the point of War and Peace, he said, was, quote, that the course of human events, even the greatest historical events, are not determined by the leaders of a nation or a state like presidents or governors or senators. They are controlled by the combined wisdom and courage and commitment and discernment and unselfishness and compassion and love and idealism of the common, ordinary people. If that was true in the case of Russia, where they had a czar, or France, where they had an emperor, how much more true is it in our own case, where the Constitution charges us with the direct responsibility for determining what our government is and ought to be? Now, I read that, but he just said that off the cuff. And the speech really launched President Carter's campaign in many ways. The gonzo journalist Hunter Thompson was in the audience that day. He was there to cover Kennedy, but it was Jimmy Carter he wrote about. And he talked about how this slow-talking Southern governor had mopped the floor with Ted Kennedy. And Carter, of course, would go on to pull off one of the biggest surprise victories in American political history. You know, just as it was in the 1970s, we face our own moments of cynicism and deep division in American political life today. And it's worth remembering that we faced situations like this before. Jimmy Carter's career is a reminder that there were times in the past when decency and competency won the day. Now, history doesn't provide any silver bullets, of course, and there's no guarantee that it will happen again. But thanks to Jimmy Carter, we have something to aim for. And we can hope that once again, Americans can pull themselves out of this cycle of cynicism and division and live up to our highest ideals. Now, I know that all of you, as proud graduates and supporters and parents of a wonderful institution like Emory, can play an important role in that noble work, and I hope you'll do it. Thank you.